For 28 years, Richard Hale, a cold and lonely millionaire CEO, built his empire but lived in silence. He avoided love, trust, and emotion, keeping his life locked away behind walls of wealth. But one simple accident, a maid spilling coffee, uncovered a hidden secret and began an unexpected love. This story will show you how loneliness can be broken, how love can appear where you least expect it, and why money alone is never enough. Stay with us until the end, and subscribe for more stories that may just change the way you see life. The story of Richard Hale is not what you think. It's not just about another CEO who built a financial empire from nothing. At just 28, Richard was at the pinnacle of success. His name echoed in boardrooms and across Wall Street, a symbol of power and untouchable wealth. He had everything money could buy: a lavish mansion of glass and marble, luxury cars, and a fortune that seemed endless. He was a millionaire CEO, a master of the market, but his life was a portrait of emptiness. His mansion, a symbol of his power and influence, felt more like a tomb. It was a cold, quiet place where Richard lived alone, with no family, no friends, no one to share his success. The silent halls and empty rooms were a stark contrast to the buzzing world he commanded. He had built an empire, yes, but he had also built walls around himself, higher and colder than any fortress. This isn't just about his money. It's about the deep isolation that came with it. You see, Richard's success was forged in solitude. Every deal he closed, every risk he took was a victory he celebrated alone. He was a man defined by his solitude, a king in a silent castle. He was always in control, always one step ahead, but he was also completely disconnected from the world. His life was a testament to the idea that you can have everything and still have nothing, a lesson many of us learn the hard way. It's a paradox of modern success. The more you gain, the more you might lose of yourself. This disconnect wasn't just a personality quirk. It was a way of life. Richard operated on a different wavelength, one where emotions were a liability and vulnerability was a weakness. He had mastered the art of being unapproachable, a ghost in his own opulent home. The world saw a powerful magnate, but they didn't see the man who lived behind the glass walls, a man trapped in a prison of his own making. He was the perfect example of a person who had everything, yet lacked the one thing that truly mattered: human connection. No one dared to question his solitude. The staff whispered about his mysterious nature, his cold eyes, and his refusal to engage. They saw him as a machine, a force of nature, not as a human being with feelings or a past. Everyone kept their distance, respecting his need for isolation. It was an unspoken rule. You don't pry into Richard Hale's life, and you don't ask about his loneliness. He was a puzzle no one dared to solve. He was a man who had everything, but lived like he had nothing. His life was a beautiful, lonely masterpiece, a testament to the idea that success isn't always what it seems. He had climbed the mountain, but he found himself alone at the peak. And his story, for years, remained a mystery. It was a tale of power and solitude, of wealth and emptiness, a story that nobody ever dared to question. But that was all about to change. The cold, impenetrable fortress Richard had built around himself was about to be challenged, not by another business rival, but by an unexpected arrival. A stranger who, without even trying, was about to crack the facade and reveal the secret behind his solitary existence. And that's when his carefully constructed world began to crumble. Her name was Emily Carter, a young woman with the weight of the world on her shoulders. For her, the world wasn't made of boardrooms and stock market numbers, but of doctor's appointments and overdue bills. She was working 2 jobs just to keep her sick mother afloat, to make sure the lights didn't go out and there was food on the table. Every single day was a battle, a desperate fight against circumstances that seemed stacked against her. She was a warrior in her own right, fighting a silent war for her family's survival, and she carried that burden with quiet strength. When she saw the job opening at the Hale mansion, it felt like a sign, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. It was a chance to finally get ahead, to have some breathing room, to maybe even start saving. She knew nothing of Richard Hale, only the rumors that he was a reclusive billionaire, a cold and detached figure. To her, he wasn't a legend. He was just an employer, a means to an end. This wasn't a dream job. It was a necessity, a way to keep her and her mother from drowning in debt and despair. She had no idea the path she was stepping onto would be so much more than just a job. She was walking into a world she couldn't possibly understand. The opulence of the mansion, the silent, sterile perfection of every room, was a stark contrast to her own chaotic life. She came from a world of hard work and struggle, and this place felt like a different planet. She was an outsider looking in, a stranger in a land of unimaginable wealth. The air was thick with the weight of its owner's history, a silent testament to a life lived in isolation. She was a speck of warmth in a sea of cold, polished marble, and her simple, honest energy was about to collide with a world built on power and control. Emily's first day started like any other workday. She was focused, determined, and a little bit nervous. She put on her uniform, took a deep breath, and began her tasks, moving silently through the sprawling rooms. She wanted to do a good job, to prove she was worthy of this chance. The mansion seemed to hold its breath around her, as if it wasn't used to the presence of someone so grounded and real. She was just a woman trying to earn a living, but her presence was a quiet rebellion against the mansion's sterile silence. The atmosphere was heavy, yet Emily was a beacon of light in this immense, quiet space. She was a reminder of the real world outside the mansion walls, a world of human struggle, connection, and vulnerability. Richard Hale, with all his money and power, was a man who had forgotten that world. His life was a sterile, controlled environment, but Emily's very existence was a disruption. She was about to bring the unpredictable, messy, and beautiful reality of life into his perfect, solitary existence. Little did she know, her simple presence was already shaking the foundations of his world. Richard had built his empire on the belief that emotions were a weakness, that control was the ultimate power. But Emily was pure emotion, pure determination and heart. She was the one thing he couldn't predict or control. Her simple, honest presence was a threat to the carefully constructed fortress he had built around his heart. Her first day seemed like it would be just another day on the job, a quiet and uneventful beginning to a new chapter. But some moments in life are bigger than they seem. That simple, quiet morning was a prelude to something far more dramatic, something that would change everything, for both of them. The air in the mansion on that gray morning was unusually thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Emily, still new to the job and exhausted from her two lives, one in the silent, imposing house, the other as a caretaker for her mother, was on edge. Her hands, calloused from hard work, were trembling slightly as she carried a tray with Richard's coffee. This wasn't just coffee. It was a symbol of his daily routine, a ritual in a life built on precision and control. She was trying to be perfect, to not mess up the one chance she had to change her life. But perfection is a fragile thing. In a split second, it all came crashing down. Her foot caught on an almost invisible detail in the Persian rug. Time seemed to slow as the cup tilted, then fell. The sound of porcelain shattering on marble echoed through the immense hall like a gunshot. Hot, dark coffee spread across the floor and, in a horrifying splash, all over Richard Hale's impossibly expensive custom-made suit. The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a living, breathing entity, a cold force that seemed to suck the air right out of the room. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure panic. And then she saw him. Richard stood at the end of the hall, his cold, piercing eyes fixed on her. The suit, a masterpiece of modern tailoring, was now stained and ruined. She expected a storm of fury, a harsh, cutting remark that would end her employment on the spot. This was it, the end of her hope, the moment her dream job slipped through her fingers. The image of her mother's tired face flashed in her mind, and a wave of hopelessness washed over her. All her hard work, all her sacrifices, and it was all over in a single clumsy moment. She started apologizing, the words tumbling out in a desperate, breathless rush. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The heat of the spilled coffee seemed insignificant compared to the icy dread that had settled in her stomach. She looked up, expecting to see a face twisted in anger, but instead, she was met with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't rage. It was something else, something much more unsettling. His eyes, usually so devoid of emotion, held a flicker of something she couldn't name. The silence stretched on, a heavy blanket of suspense. Her mind raced with what she had heard about him, the stories of his ruthless nature and how he had no tolerance for mistakes. She was just a small, insignificant person in his world, a world where such an error was likely unforgivable. She imagined the words he would use to dismiss her, the cold finality of his decision. But he didn't say any of them. He just stood there, observing her, his silence 1,000 times more potent than any shout. Everyone who worked in the mansion had braced themselves for the inevitable explosion. The other staff members, peeking from hallways, had already written her off. A mistake this big, this early on? It was unheard of. They fully expected her to be gone by the end of the hour. A cautionary tale for anyone else who dared to be human in Richard Hale's perfect world. They were all holding their breath, waiting for the fury that never came. But instead of the fiery outburst everyone expected, Richard did something completely shocking. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, as the silence spoke volumes. And in that moment, Emily realized this man was not what the rumors said. He was something else, something far more complicated. And his silence was about to reveal a secret far deeper than anyone had ever guessed. What followed wasn't a roar of anger, but a stillness that was far more unnerving. Richard Hale simply stared, his gaze cutting right through Emily. His silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a weight that was sharper than any shouted word. It felt like a test, a silent judgment that she was failing with every frantic, whispered apology. Emily's hands trembled, a physical manifestation of her fear and embarrassment. She felt small, exposed, and completely at his mercy. She couldn't understand why he wasn't reacting, why he wasn't confirming her worst fears. He was a man known for his decisive, ruthless nature, yet here he was, just standing. His reaction was so out of character that it left everyone speechless. The other staff, watching from a distance, exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the Richard they knew. His stillness was a puzzle, a complete subversion of all expectations. Emily, lost in her own panic, just kept apologizing, a broken record of regret. She couldn't process this quiet storm, this strange, unreadable calm. She had prepared herself for a scene, a tirade, but this eerie quiet was infinitely more terrifying. It was a complete shift in the power dynamic, a moment that exposed the fragile nature of their professional relationship. Finally, a single word broke the silence. "Leave it," Richard whispered, his voice so low and flat it was barely audible. It was a command, not a request, and it carried a finality that made Emily stop dead in her tracks. She looked at him, searching for a clue, a sign of his true feelings. His face was a mask, but his eyes told a different story. For a fleeting second, she saw something flicker behind them, a flash of pain, a shadow of an old memory. It was a crack in the ice, a glimpse into a world of emotion he had carefully hidden away for years. She had no idea that her clumsy accident hadn't just spilled coffee. It had broken through a carefully constructed facade. The moment was charged with an emotional tension that had nothing to do with a stained suit. Richard's gaze wasn't one of anger but of reflection. He was looking at her, but he was seeing something else, someone else. This wasn't a simple accident to him. It was a trigger, a painful reminder of a past he had worked so hard to bury. Emily's nervous fumbling and genuine apologies weren't just an inconvenience. They had touched a raw nerve, a deeply personal wound he never thought would be exposed again. She didn't know it, but her simple mistake had unlocked a door to his past, a past filled with pain and betrayal. The broken cup, the spilled coffee, they weren't just a mess to be cleaned up. They were a sudden, jarring echo of something he had lost, something that had shaped him into the cold man he was today. The air between them, once so thick with suspense, was now filled with the silent resonance of a shared, though misunderstood, emotional moment. The mansion, which had seemed so sterile and perfect, suddenly felt a little bit more human. Emily's honest mistake had introduced a moment of beautiful, chaotic imperfection into a life built on flawless control. She had no idea that her small act of clumsiness would be the very thing to begin to thaw a frozen heart. The ice was starting to melt, just a little bit, and what lay beneath was a story he never wanted anyone to know. Her first day in the mansion was already proving to be anything but ordinary. She had done something no one else had. She had made Richard Hale feel something. The silence, the strange reaction, the brief glimpse into his soul. It all pointed to a deeper story, and as she bent down to clean up the mess, she had no idea that this one, tiny moment had just set a new path in motion. A path that would lead her to the deepest secrets of the mansion and the man who owned it. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's curiosity about Richard Hale only grew. The mansion, with its grand scale and meticulous upkeep, was a paradox. It looked perfect on the outside, but the more time Emily spent there, the more she realized it was a place of ghosts, not a home. She noticed the small, telling details. The doors to certain rooms were always locked, a thick layer of dust covering the doorknobs. It was as if entire sections of the house had been sealed off from time itself. The silence, once just a backdrop, now felt heavy, almost suffocating. It was a silence filled with unspoken stories and forgotten memories. Emily, a person who found comfort in noise and life, felt the weight of it in every hall. The grand portraits on the walls, with their subjects' stern, unsmiling faces, seemed to watch her, silent sentinels guarding the house's secrets. They were untouched by time but also by life, a perfect metaphor for the mansion itself. She felt a profound sadness for the man who owned it all. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was working in a museum, not a house. Every object, every piece of furniture, seemed to hold a memory that was too painful to touch. The atmosphere was one of a life frozen in time, a beautiful but sterile tableau. The wealth was undeniable, but it felt more like a cage than a comfort. It was a prison of gold and marble, and Richard was its sole, self-imposed prisoner. Emily, in her simple humanity, was a living, breathing anachronism in this perfect, static world. Her simple tasks became a quiet rebellion against the silence. She'd hum a little tune as she dusted, a small, defiant act of life in a place that felt so dead. She found herself trying to imagine what these rooms looked like when they were full of people, full of laughter and conversation. But the emptiness always won, and the silence would return, heavier than before. It was a constant reminder of the profound loneliness that defined this place. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was a character in its own right, a silent witness to a life lived in solitude. Emily realized that the house was a reflection of the man who lived in it. Cold, beautiful, and utterly empty on the inside. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a monument to a past that had broken its owner and left him with only his wealth for company. This realization fueled her curiosity even more. She wanted to understand the secrets held within these walls. What had happened here? What had made Richard Hale retreat so completely from the world? Her empathy for him grew with every passing day, a quiet, insistent voice in the back of her mind. She felt a connection to the man behind the persona, a glimpse of a soul she knew was aching for release. And one evening, while working late, that connection became a shocking reality. She was in a part of the house she had never been in before, and she saw a light coming from a room that was supposed to be locked. Driven by an irresistible pull, she approached the door, and what she discovered inside was a secret that Richard had buried deep, something he never, ever wanted anyone to see. That evening, as the mansion settled into its usual silence, Emily found herself in the one room that seemed to hold the most secrets, Richard's study. It was a place of controlled chaos, with stacks of papers and books piled high. As she tidied a corner, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic under a stack of old reports. It was a small, ornate box, dusty and clearly untouched for a long time. The feeling of history was almost tangible, and a quiet sense of curiosity compelled her to open it. She just had to know what was inside. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw it. Inside the box, tucked away like a precious, painful secret, was a photograph. It was a picture of a young Richard, maybe a teenager with a wide, innocent smile standing between his parents. His father had his hand on Richard's shoulder, a proud look on his face, and his mother was smiling warmly. It was a glimpse of a different Richard, a boy full of life and joy, a stark contrast to the cold man she knew. But the photo was brutally torn in half, the half with his mother and father carefully separated from the half with him. The tear was not clean. It was jagged, a violent act that spoke of a deep wound. The sight of the torn picture was heartbreaking. It was a physical representation of the emotional chasm that separated him from his past. Why would someone keep a photo like this? Why not just throw it away? The act of keeping it, and keeping it hidden, spoke volumes about the pain it represented. It wasn't just a memory, it was a scar. As Emily held the two pieces in her hands, she felt a profound sense of sadness for the man who had been a boy in this picture. A boy who had his life torn in two. She was so engrossed in the mystery that she didn't hear the door open. A cold wave of dread washed over her as she felt a presence behind her. She turned and saw Richard standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the photo in her hands. His face, usually so composed and emotionless, was pale, and his jaw was clenched. He wasn't angry, he was mortified, exposed. The look in his eyes was one of pure vulnerability, a look he had never shown her before. In that moment, she realized she hadn't just found a picture. She had stumbled upon the most carefully guarded secret of his life, the very core of his isolation. He didn't need to say a word. His reaction was all the confirmation she needed. This wasn't just a torn photo of his family. It was the key to understanding him, to understanding the fortress he had built around himself. The picture was the physical manifestation of his emotional trauma, a silent scream from his past. Emily's hand started shaking again, but this time it wasn't out of fear, but out of a deep sense of a sympathy and empathy for the man who had lost so much. The question hung in the air, unspoken but powerful. Why would a man so powerful, so in control of his world, hide a broken picture of his own family? Why not just get rid of it? The answer wasn't simple. The act of hiding it meant it was too painful to look at, but too important to throw away. It was a memory he was desperate to both forget and hold on to. She had just seen a side of him that no one else had, a glimpse of the boy whose life was split in two. And the silence that followed was different now. It was no longer cold and impersonal. It was heavy with the weight of a shared, painful secret. Emily had just stepped over a line she didn't even know existed, and in that moment, she understood that the mansion was not just a prison of wealth. It was a mausoleum of a lost family, and Richard was its sole mourner. And her discovery would soon lead to a warning that would change everything. The following morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was different. Emily, still reeling from her discovery the night before, felt a new kind of tension in the air. As she was finishing her duties, Richard's personal assistant, a stern-faced woman named Sandra, pulled her aside. Sandra had a reputation for being as cold and guarded as her boss, and her expression was unusually serious. She looked at Emily with a mixture of concern and pity, and her voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial whisper. It was an unspoken warning, a moment of breaking ranks to protect someone who was about to get hurt. "Don't get close to him," Sandra said, her eyes never leaving Emily's. "Many have tried. They all thought they could be the one to change him, to break through his walls. But trust me, they were all pushed away." The warning was delivered with a kind of weary finality, as if she'd seen this play out 100 times before. She told Emily that Richard had built his entire world on a foundation of control, that he didn't believe in love or trust. To him, they were nothing more than weaknesses, liabilities that would inevitably lead to pain and betrayal. He had made his life a fortress, and he was the sole, unyielding warden. The words were meant to be a deterrent, a cold dose of reality to scare Emily away from her growing curiosity. But instead, they had the opposite effect. Sandra's warning painted a picture of a man who was not just cold, but deeply wounded. Emily's heart ached for the boy in the torn photograph, and the man who had become a prisoner of his own pain. The more she learned about his loneliness and the walls he had built, the more she wanted to understand why. She couldn't see him as just a boss anymore. She saw a person who was a victim of a story he never wanted to tell. Emily found herself thinking, what kind of pain could be so deep that it would make a person reject all human connection? What would have to happen to make someone believe that love and trust are dangerous? The warning that was meant to create distance between them only served to draw her closer. She saw a challenge, not a dead end. She felt a deep, instinctive empathy for the man who was so outwardly powerful but so internally broken. She couldn't shake the image of the torn photograph from her mind. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the key to understanding everything Sandra had just said. The picture wasn't just a memory. It was the origin of his distrust. And the warning, with its emphasis on his lack of belief in love, only confirmed her suspicion. Emily knew there was a secret, a foundational trauma that had shaped him into the cold man he was today. Sandra's words were a heavy anchor, meant to keep Emily from exploring the depths of Richard's emotional fortress. But for Emily, that anchor became a key, unlocking a deeper resolve to understand. She saw the truth behind the tough words, the raw hurt that drove him to push everyone away. She wasn't afraid of his anger. She was intrigued by his pain. The story was no longer just about a job for Emily. It was now about a man, a mission, and a mystery. And as the mansion's silence wrapped around her again, she knew she was about to do the one thing no one else had ever dared to do. Get closer to Richard Hale, no matter the consequences. After Sandra's chilling warning, Emily knew she had to be careful. But something inside her wouldn't let her back away. Instead of heeding the advice to keep her distance, she decided on a different approach. She chose to fight the cold with warmth, the silence with small gestures of kindness. It was a risky game, a quiet rebellion against the fortress Richard had built around himself, but she was determined. She began leaving small, handwritten notes of encouragement on his desk, simple, human messages like, "Have a good day," or "Don't skip meals." They were small acts, but they were filled with genuine care, a stark contrast to the transactional nature of his world. At first, Richard completely ignored them. The notes were just another piece of paper on his desk, an insignificant distraction in his world of billion-dollar deals and calculated moves. He would either push them aside or, more often, have Sandra dispose of them without a second thought. To him, they were a puzzling intrusion, a sign of a vulnerability he refused to acknowledge. He had spent so long building his walls that he couldn't comprehend why anyone would try to knock on them, especially a person he considered a stranger. He saw them as a weakness, a sign of a softness he had long since abandoned. But Emily was persistent. She continued leaving the notes, a quiet, daily ritual of empathy. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply offering a small piece of humanity. And one night, something shifted. Richard was alone in his study, the mansion's silence heavier than usual. He had just finished a grueling day of negotiations, and the weight of his solitary success was crushing. He saw one of her notes on his desk, a simple piece of paper with the words, "Don't forget to take a break." For the first time, he didn't push it away. He picked it up and read it, the simple words a jarring contrast to the complex world he inhabited. In that moment, something inside him softened. He crumpled the note, but instead of throwing it in the trash, he slipped it into the pocket of his suit jacket. It was a small, almost imperceptible act, but it was a sign of a colossal change. That simple piece of paper, with its unassuming message, had gotten through his defenses. It was a silent acknowledgement that he had seen her, and he had felt the warmth of her gesture. It was a tiny crack in the ice, and in his pocket, a small act of kindness was starting to thaw a heart he thought was frozen forever. Emily's actions were a quiet challenge to everything he believed about the world. He had built his empire on the belief that everyone was driven by self-interest, but here was a person who was offering something with no expectation of return. It was a concept so foreign to him that it was both baffling and, in a way, incredibly compelling. He couldn't shake the feeling of the note in his pocket, a small piece of warmth in a world that had always been cold. The tiny notes were more than just paper. They were a lifeline, a gentle tug on a heart that was drowning in its own isolation. Emily's kindness wasn't loud or demanding. It was persistent and real. She was teaching him, without even knowing it, that there were still people in the world who cared without an agenda. She was planting a seed of hope in a barren landscape, a seed that had finally found a crack in the cold, hard ground of his heart. And as he sat alone in his silent office, with the note in his pocket, Richard began to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. A fragile, unfamiliar sense of connection. The storm of emotion he had buried for so long was about to begin brewing, and he had no idea what to do about it. He had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to keep everything. His business, his life, his emotions in perfect order. But Emily's small notes and quiet presence were a constant disruption. He found himself unconsciously looking for her in the halls, his ear attuned to her soft footsteps. He started to notice the little things about her. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about her mother, the quiet strength in her demeanor, the unshakable resilience that defined her. She wasn't like the people in his world, people who were always performing, always calculating. She was just real, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a fragile feeling of humanity began to stir within him. It was a foreign sensation, a warmth he hadn't felt since he was a boy. It was a powerful, unsettling mix of emotions. Curiosity, admiration, and a deep, almost painful, longing for connection. This was a direct threat to the fortress he had spent so long building. Emotions he had always believed were dangerous. They made you vulnerable, they exposed you to betrayal, they led to the kind of pain he had experienced in the past. To feel something for Emily was to invite a risk he was not willing to take. He tried to fight it, to push her out of his mind. He worked longer hours, buried himself in more complex deals, and made his commands to the staff even colder and more direct. He was trying to reassert his control, to prove to himself that he was still the same man, the one who didn't need anyone. But the harder he fought against these new feelings, the more powerful they became. Like a storm brewing on the horizon, the emotions swelled inside him, a powerful and chaotic force he couldn't control. It was a battle between his carefully constructed armor and the quiet, persistent warmth of her presence. The mansion, once a silent monument to his success, now felt different. Her light, her resilience, had seeped into the very walls. The quiet that had once felt comforting now felt lonely. Her absence from a room was more noticeable than her presence. He was no longer just a millionaire CEO in a mansion. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage, and the key to his freedom was the very thing he was so afraid of, a genuine human connection. He found himself replaying her conversations, her laughter, the way she spoke with such honest passion about her family. It was a world he had long since forgotten, a world of genuine love and connection. He had all the money in the world, but she had something he was desperately missing, something he couldn't buy. The wealth he had accumulated felt meaningless in the face of her quiet strength. He was beginning to realize that his fortress of solitude was not a protection. It was a prison. And Emily, with her simple notes and quiet kindness, had become the one person he couldn't ignore, the one person whose presence was slowly, irrevocably, changing him. He was losing control, and the feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. But just as he was starting to let his guard down, a new kind of threat emerged, one that would force him to confront his deepest fears and question everything he was beginning to believe about Emily. A threat that came from an unexpected source, ready to take everything away from him once again. Just as the walls around Richard's heart were beginning to crumble, a different kind of threat emerged, one that was far more insidious than a simple accident. His business partner, Victor, a man he had trusted for years, had been watching him closely. Victor was a shark in a tailored suit, and he saw Richard's growing connection to Emily not as a sign of humanity, but as a dangerous vulnerability. He saw it as a weakness that could threaten the financial empire they had built together. In his cold, calculated mind, Emily was a liability, a distraction that was making Richard soft and unpredictable. Victor decided to strike at the exact moment of Richard's emotional fragility. He began a quiet campaign of whispers, planting seeds of doubt in Richard's ear. "She's only after your money," he would say casually. "This kind of girl, they see a man like you and they see a future, not a person." The words were like poison, designed to tap into Richard's deepest, most ingrained fear, the fear of betrayal. They were a cruel reminder of the past, of the reason he had built his fortress in the first place. Victor was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly which buttons to push to shatter Richard's newfound, fragile trust. Richard's mind, so used to seeing the world in terms of risk and reward, began to turn Victor's words over and over. He had almost forgotten the pain of being used, of having his trust broken. Victor's warnings were a cold bucket of water on the fire of his emotions. The old suspicions, the deep-seated belief that everyone was out for themselves, came flooding back. He began to look at Emily through a new lens, a lens of suspicion and doubt. He questioned her motives, her kindness, her every action. Was she really a beacon of light, or was she just a clever opportunist? The uncertainty was a dagger to his heart. The warmth that had begun to grow within him turned into a knot of anxiety. He found himself retreating once more, his old habits of isolation reasserting themselves. He avoided Emily, his gaze turning cold and distant whenever she was near. The quiet moments of connection were replaced by an awkward silence, a new kind of tension that felt heavier than before. He was on the verge of pushing her away, of repeating the cycle of pain and rejection that had defined his life for so long. He was a man fighting a battle on two fronts, the storm of emotion within him and the insidious whispers of a supposed friend. Victor's actions were a deliberate and cruel test of Richard's character. He had successfully tapped into Richard's greatest fear, bringing all his emotional progress to a screeching halt. The fragile hope that Emily had ignited was now teetering on the edge of destruction. Richard's mind was a battlefield, with his growing feelings for Emily fighting against the ghosts of his past and the new, cunning betrayal from Victor. The question that lingered in the silent halls of the mansion was terrifyingly simple. Would he let his fear win? This was a critical moment for Richard. Would he give in to the darkness, confirming Victor's cynical view of the world and his own worst fears? Would he push Emily away, just like he had with everyone else who had tried to get close? The walls were back up, but this time he was the one putting the bricks in place. And he was about to make a decision that would either save him or damn him to a life of perpetual solitude. His fragile emotional breakthrough was about to be tested in the most painful way imaginable, and the fate of both his heart and his empire hung in the balance. The stage was set for a heartbreaking confrontation. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and Richard, blinded by his old fears, was about to make a mistake that could cost him everything. He was about to shut the one door that had finally opened, believing that he was protecting himself, but in reality, he was only cementing his own loneliness. The final act was about to begin, but it wouldn't be a happy one, at least not at first. The poison of Victor's words had done its job. Richard, blinded by old fears and new doubts, finally reached his breaking point. One evening, he confronted Emily in the silent hall of the mansion. His voice was cold and filled with a finality that cut deeper than any shout. He accused her of using him, of only being there for his money. The words were sharp, cruel, and designed to push her away, to end the fragile connection he was so terrified of. He was lashing out not because he believed it, but because it was easier than admitting he was scared to feel. Emily was completely blindsided. The man who had been slowly opening up to her was gone, replaced by the cold, unfeeling CEO she had first heard about. The kindness, the small moments of shared humanity, they all seemed to have been an illusion. The tears came fast and hot, a physical manifestation of her heartbreak and confusion. The rejection was brutal, and it felt like a betrayal of her own good intentions. She had risked her heart for a man she barely knew, and he had thrown it back in her face. The weight of his final words was too much to bear, and she left the mansion, not with anger, but with a profound sense of sadness. The moment Emily walked out the door, the mansion's silence returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't the sterile quiet he was used to. It was a deafening, unbearable void. The silence was no longer a sign of control. It was a punishment, a constant reminder of the mistake he had just made. The air felt heavy with her absence, and for the first time, his vast wealth felt completely meaningless. He was surrounded by opulence, but he was utterly, miserably alone. He had pushed away the one person who saw him for who he was, and in doing so, he had confirmed his greatest fear, that he was destined to be alone forever. The fortress he had built around his heart was back in place, but it felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. The victory he had felt in pushing her away was hollow. He had won the battle against his emotions, but he had lost the war for his soul. He was a king in a silent castle, but the crown felt heavier than ever, and the loneliness was a tangible, suffocating presence. He had chosen the safety of solitude over the risk of connection, and the price he paid was unbearable. He tried to go back to his old life, to bury himself in work and forget about her. But her image was everywhere, in the silent hallways, in the notes he had crumpled and saved, and in the sudden, sharp pang of regret that pierced his heart every time he thought of her tear-filled eyes. He had convinced himself that pushing her away was an act of self-preservation, but now he realized it was an act of self-destruction. He had betrayed her, and in doing so, he had betrayed himself. The pain he felt was far worse than the fear that had driven him to it. He was a prisoner in his own life, haunted by a ghost he had created. He had pushed away the one thing that was beginning to save him. The mansion was silent, but his mind was in a turmoil, a chaotic storm of regret and self-loathing. He was finally alone, just as he had always wanted, and he had never felt so miserable in his entire life. And then, on a dark, desperate night, the truth he had been avoiding for so long would finally hit him. It wouldn't come from a quiet moment of reflection, but from a sudden, brutal revelation that would force him to confront the real betrayer, the one who had been working against him all along, and it was a truth that would change everything. He thought the pain of losing Emily was the worst he could feel. He was wrong. The final, brutal revelation came not from an emotional breakdown, but from a cold, hard financial audit. He had been suspicious of a few numbers, and after a series of late-night investigations, he uncovered the truth. His trusted business partner, Victor, the man who had been whispering poison in his ear about Emily, had been stealing from the company for years. He had used his position to siphon off millions, systematically dismantling the very empire Richard had so meticulously built. The betrayal was complete, a financial and personal betrayal that went far deeper than he could have ever imagined. The foundation of his world, built on control and calculation, crumbled in an instant. The financial empire, his source of identity and power, was falling apart. The very person he had trusted with his business, the person who had convinced him to push away the one person who cared, was the one who had been betraying him all along. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He had chosen to trust a thief and a liar over a woman who had offered him genuine kindness. His fortress of solitude hadn't protected him from anything. It had only made him a target for the real enemy. Alone in his dark, silent study, the weight of his reality came crashing down. The empire was in ruins, his trust was shattered, and the one person who could have helped him was gone, pushed away by his own hand. There was no one to call, no one to confide in, no one to offer a word of comfort. He was a millionaire with nothing, a king with no kingdom, a man with no one. The tears came unbidden, a torrent of grief he had held back for decades. It wasn't just for the money or the business. It was for the loneliness, for the betrayal, and for the profound, terrible mistake he had made. The sound of his own sobs was a foreign and unwelcome noise in the cold, perfect silence of the mansion. It was the sound of a heart breaking, not from a financial loss, but from a lifetime of emotional neglect, and now, a deep and painful betrayal. He had always believed he was in control, that he was strong enough to face anything alone. But in that moment, in the darkness, with his empire in ruins and his heart in pieces, he was just a broken man. The wealth was gone, the power was gone, and the only thing left was an unbearable loneliness. He had pushed away love for a lie, and the universe had punished him by taking away the only thing he had left: his money. He had chosen fear over faith, and now he was left with nothing. The silence in the mansion was no longer just silent. It was a mausoleum of his past mistakes. Every room, every piece of expensive art, was a monument to his arrogance and his profound sense of isolation. He had believed that his money was his shield, but in the end, it was only a target. He was at his lowest point, a moment of complete and utter defeat. He had no one to turn to, no one to help him pick up the pieces. He was a man who had everything and had now lost it all, a powerful CEO reduced to a broken man crying in the dark. The final lesson of his life was hitting him like a tidal wave, a lesson he was learning far too late. But in that moment of complete and utter despair, just as he thought he was truly alone, the impossible happened. A figure appeared in the doorway, a soft silhouette in the dim light. A person he had pushed away, a person he didn't deserve, was standing there watching him. And in his moment of greatest weakness, someone he never expected to see again walked back into his life. Emily's return was not a grand gesture or a dramatic monologue. It was a quiet, profound act of loyalty. She hadn't come back for a paycheck or to gloat. She came back because, despite his cruel words, she knew the man behind the cold facade was hurting. Her intuition, that simple human quality he had long since abandoned, told her he was in trouble. She had heard the news of the financial scandal, of Victor's betrayal, and she knew in her heart that Richard was at his lowest point. She had seen the lost boy in the torn photograph, and she knew he needed someone, even if he didn't know it himself. As she walked into the study, the silence was no longer a sign of his power, but a testament to his brokenness. She saw him not as the powerful millionaire CEO, but as a shattered man crying in the dark. She didn't say a word. She just sat with him, a quiet, reassuring presence in his moment of total collapse. She was a beacon of light in his self-imposed darkness, a testament to the fact that not everyone was out to use him. She was there for the man, not for the money, and her simple, unwavering presence was the most powerful proof he could have ever received. Her loyalty was tested in the moment he least deserved it. He had pushed her away with cruel words, and yet here she was, standing by him as his world fell apart. She had every reason to walk away, to let him face his downfall alone, but she didn't. Her forgiveness was a quiet, powerful act, a lesson in unconditional care he never thought he would receive. She had believed in him when he didn't even believe in himself, and she had proven her character when his was at its most questionable. In that moment, he saw the true meaning of wealth, not in his bank account, but in the unwavering loyalty of a kind heart. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. Emily wasn't after his money. She had always cared for the man behind it. The very thing he had accused her of was the very thing she was proving wrong with her actions. Victor had used his fear of betrayal to manipulate him, and in doing so, had exposed the profound and genuine nature of Emily's character. He had been so blind, so consumed by his own trust issues, that he had pushed away the one person who was a true and honest friend. The truth was a painful but necessary revelation, and it finally set him free. In that profound moment, the ice around his heart, the fortress he had built for 28 years, finally shattered. It wasn't a dramatic breaking, but a gentle, unstoppable thaw. Her presence, her kindness, her quiet support, finally reached the core of his pain and began to heal it. He had tried to protect himself with coldness and money, but in the end, it was a simple act of human kindness that saved him. He had lost his empire, but he had found something far more valuable. He had found a person who saw past his wealth and his power to the scared, lonely man beneath. He had found a genuine connection, a true friend, and a love he didn't know he was capable of receiving. The collapse of his financial world had been the very thing that forced him to open his heart and finally see the light in his life. He was broken, but for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't alone. The confession didn't happen in a brightly lit room or a quiet office. It happened on a stormy night, with the rain coming down in sheets, a perfect reflection of the chaos and cleansing happening inside him. Richard found Emily outside the mansion, her small figure illuminated by the porch light, and in that moment, all his pride and fear were washed away. He had to tell her the truth, not just about Victor, but about himself. He had to be honest for the first time in his life, even if it meant exposing his deepest wounds. With the rain mixing with his tears, he confessed everything. His voice was raw with emotion, a sound so unfamiliar to him. He told her about the boy in the torn photograph, about the pain he had buried, about the walls he had built. He looked at her, his face a mess of grief and relief, and finally said the words he had never thought he would say. For 28 years, I lived alone, but I can't live like this anymore. It was an admission of defeat and a plea for a new beginning. He was no longer the powerful CEO. He was just a man, finally ready to let go of his solitude. Emily's eyes filled with emotion as she listened. She didn't offer a quick solution or a simple answer. Instead, she offered the most profound truth he had ever heard. She stepped closer, and in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she said, "You were never alone. You just didn't let anyone in." Her words were a gentle but powerful correction. He hadn't been living in solitude. He had been living in a self-imposed prison. Her words were a key, unlocking a perspective he had been blind to his entire life. He had always believed he was a victim of his circumstances, but she showed him that he had been the one keeping himself locked away. In that moment, under the cold, cleansing rain, the final barrier between them dissolved. The confession was a bridge, and her words were the foundation of a new reality. The love that had been growing silently between them was no longer a secret. It was born in the most unexpected place, not in a romantic dinner or a grand gesture, but in a moment of absolute vulnerability and brutal honesty. It was a love that was built on a foundation of shared pain and profound understanding, a love that was real and true because it had been forged in the fire of his greatest collapse. He finally understood that love wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. He had spent his life building an empire of money and power, only to realize that the most valuable thing he could ever have was the love of a woman who saw him for who he was, flaws and all. The storm outside was a final farewell to his old life, and her presence was the first sign of a new, brighter day. The story was no longer about a rich man and a poor girl. It was about two souls who found each other in the most desperate of circumstances. The rain was washing away his past, and her love was paving the way for his future. He had lost everything he thought was important, only to find the one thing he had always needed. And that night, under the stormy sky, their shared truth became the beginning of their new life together. With Emily by his side, Richard began the painstaking process of rebuilding his empire. The cold, calculating man he once was had been replaced by a leader who understood the true value of people. He didn't just rebuild his company, he transformed it. He brought in a new culture of trust, loyalty, and human connection, lessons he had learned from Emily. The empire, once a monument to his isolation, became a testament to his transformation. He had a partner in every sense of the word, a quiet force who gave him strength he never knew he needed. She wasn't just his employee. She was his co-pilot, and together, they built something more resilient and more meaningful than he ever could have alone. The mansion, once a silent tomb of wealth, was finally alive. It was no longer a place of ghosts and unspoken pain, but a home filled with laughter and warmth. The dusty portraits were cleaned, the locked rooms were opened, and the empty halls were filled with the sound of life. They hosted dinners for friends, family gatherings, and quiet nights of conversation. The sterile perfection was replaced with a comfortable, lived-in warmth, and the silence was replaced with a hope that echoed in every corner of the house. The mansion wasn't just a place to live. It was a sanctuary, a living testament to the power of a heart that was finally open. Richard finally understood the truth, a profound lesson he had learned through a financial collapse and a personal breakthrough. He had spent his entire life believing that money builds walls, that it was a shield to protect him from the world. But he had learned, in the most painful way possible, that those walls didn't protect him. They just trapped him. Emily, with her simple act of kindness and unwavering loyalty, had taught him that it's love that breaks them down. It was a truth so simple, yet so powerful, that it had changed the course of his entire life. He realized that true wealth wasn't measured in the size of his bank account or the power of his empire. It was measured in the quality of his relationships, in the depth of his connections, and in the love he was finally willing to give and receive. He had found his ultimate success not in a boardroom, but in the heart of a woman who had seen past his wealth and loved him for who he was. The millionaire CEO who lived alone for 28 years had finally found his purpose. It wasn't to build a bigger empire, but to live a fuller life, a life filled with connection, meaning, and love. The story of his rise was no longer just about financial success. It was about human triumph, a journey from isolation to connection, from a world of cold control to a life of warm, honest love. And that truth, that simple, beautiful truth about money and love, would stay with him for the rest of his life. A constant reminder that the greatest wealth of all has nothing to do with what you can buy, and everything to do with what you can feel. For 28 years, Richard Hale was a cold and lonely millionaire CEO. But one maid, one accident, and one simple act of kindness changed everything. His story reminds us that the greatest wealth is not money, but love and trust. If this story touched you, subscribe to Millionaire Breakthrough and join us for more powerful stories of love, redemption, and unexpected transformation.